Welcome to our deep dive, and today we're going to be exploring Victorian poetry.
Oh, fantastic.
You've provided some really fascinating source material for this one. We've got a mix of like historical context, famous poems, analysis.
Very good.
I'm really excited to kind of dig in and see what we can uncover together.
Yeah.
So to set the scene for our listeners, I want you to imagine, gas lamps illuminating London's foggy streets,
Yeah.
groundbreaking scientific discoveries, challenging age-old beliefs,
Right.
and the society that's kind of grappling with its place in a rapidly changing world.
Yeah.
That's the Victorian era, and its poetry gives us this really unique window, I think, into the hearts and minds of the people who lived through it.
Absolutely. And what's remarkable is how much those words still resonate with us today.
Oh,
I
totally.
mean, we might not be riding in horse-drawn carriages,
Right.
but we are facing our own versions of those same anxieties, the impact of technology,
Yeah.
shifting social norms, the search for meaning in a world that can feel increasingly complex.
Yeah. It's like they were grappling with the first wave of what we're experiencing now, right?
Definitely.
It's like the digital revolution, artificial intelligence, the constant bombardment of information. Maybe by understanding their struggles, we can gain some insights into our own.
Definitely, yeah. So let's start by setting the stage a little bit. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901,
Okay.
was a time of just immense upheaval. Think Darwin's theory of evolution shaking the foundations of religious belief,
Wow.
or the rise of factories, right?
Yeah.
Transforming the landscape and social fabric of England.
Yeah.
It was a period of immense progress, but also one of profound loss and uncertainty.
So it sounds like a real time of contradictions, innovation and anxiety, progress and displacement, all kind of swirling together.
Exactly, and that's what makes Victorian poetry so compelling. It's a reflection of these contradictions,
Yeah.
right? It's a conversation with the forces that were shaping the world.
Yeah.
And these poets weren't just passively observing these changes.
Right.
They were wrestling with them. They were
Yeah.
trying to make sense of their place in this new reality.
So when we talk about Victorian poetry, let's unpack that a little bit.
Sure.
I think I'm ready to go beyond the stereotypes, the flowery language and the romantic love poems. What are some of the key characteristics that set this era's poetry apart?
Well, one striking feature is its direct engagement with social and moral issues. These poets weren't afraid to tackle the big questions of their day.
Okay.
Poverty, class inequality, the role of women in society, the changing nature of faith. They were holding up a mirror to their society,
Wow.
critiquing its flaws while also searching for meaning and beauty within it.
So it wasn't just about pretty words and rhyming couplets. It was about using poetry to engage with real-world problems, kind of like a 19th century version of spoken word or slam poetry.
You could say that. Take Alfred Tennyson, for example.
Okay.
He was the poet laureate of England,
Wow.
basically the rock star poet of his time.
Okay.
And he wasn't afraid to use his platform to address the anxieties of the age.
So Tennyson, poet laureate, definitely someone we need to talk about. What kind of work was he doing that made him so influential?
Well, one of his most famous works, In Memoriam AHH, is a powerful example of how Victorian poets grappled with both personal loss and larger questions of faith.
Okay.
It's an elegy written for his dear friend Arthur Hallam, who died tragically young. And it's this profoundly moving exploration of grief, doubt,
Yeah.
and the search for meaning in a world that suddenly feels devoid of it.
It's amazing how poetry can give voice to those feelings of loss and uncertainty that can be so hard to articulate otherwise.
Absolutely. And what makes In Memoriam so unique is its structure.
Mhm.
It's over 130 cantos long, composed of these interconnected quatrains that create this meditative,
Yeah.
cyclical
Well,
effect.
it's a poem you could really get lost in.
Absolutely. And every time you revisit it, you discover new layers of meaning.
I imagine reading it almost feels like having a deep conversation with Tennyson himself,
Yeah.
sharing in his journey of grief and reflection.
You've hit the nail on the head. And if we're talking about Tennyson, we can't forget The Lady of Shalott,
Of
the
course.
poem about the woman isolated in a tower,
Right.
experiencing the world only through reflections in a mirror. It's this hauntingly beautiful poem that speaks to the longing for connection
Yeah.
and the dangers of isolation, themes that still resonate with us today in our age of social media and virtual reality.
That's so true. I mean, we might not be literally trapped in towers, but so many of us experience the world through screens.
Right.
And there's this real question, I think, of how that affects our relationships and sense of self.
Exactly. And The Lady of Shalott also raises questions about the role of the artist in society.
Okay.
The lady is often interpreted as a symbol of the artist, isolated from the world, but also trying to capture its essence through her art.
Interesting.
This idea of the artist as both observer and participant, struggling to find a balance between detachment and engagement, that's a thread that runs through a lot of Victorian poetry.
So we've got social commentary, personal grief, reflections on the role of the artist. Sounds like Tennyson was really tapping into the anxieties and complexities of his time.
He was,
Hmm.
and he wasn't alone. Another major figure we need to talk about is Robert Browning, the master of the dramatic monologue.
Ah, yes, the dramatic monologue. I remember you mentioning this in our prep notes. Sounds super intriguing.
It is.
Like we're getting a direct line into someone's inner world. Tell me more.
Imagine listening to a single speaker,
Right.
revealing their thoughts and feelings in this long, uninterrupted speech.
Oh, wow.
It's like eavesdropping on a confession
Okay.
or a therapy session,
Yeah.
where you're piecing together the truth about this person based solely on their words and the way they tell their story.
Okay, I'm already hooked. What kind of characters did Browning bring to life through this form?
Well, one of his most famous dramatic monologues is My Last Duchess. And it's a perfect example of how Browning used this form to not only reveal character, but also subtly critique social norms. The poem features a duke who's showing a visitor around his palace and casually points out a portrait of his late wife, the Duchess.
Right.
And at first, he seems to be praising her beauty.
Yeah.
But as he talks, you realize something much darker is going on.
Okay, give me the juicy details. What's so unsettling about the Duke?
His words reveal a disturbing level of possessiveness and control. He's jealous of the Duchess's simple acts of kindness,
Wow.
her joy in life, even the way she smiled at others. And it's heavily implied that he had her killed because she didn't conform to his expectations.
That's chilling. It's almost like he's confessing to a crime without realizing it.
Right.
Browning is subtly exposing this dark side of power dynamics and masculinity in Victorian society.
Exactly. And what's so brilliant is that he does it all through the Duke's own words.
Yeah.
Right? You're left to draw your own conclusions about his character and the events that led to the Duchess's demise. It's a masterclass in psychological realism and social commentary, all wrapped up in this seemingly simple form of a single speaker addressing a silent listener.
So Browning wasn't just interested in telling stories, he was fascinated by the psychology of his characters,
Yes.
particularly those darker impulses that often lurk beneath the surface.
Precisely. And this interest in psychology, in delving into the complex motivations and inner lives of individuals,
Right.
that was a hallmark of Victorian literature. Browning's work paved the way for writers to explore these themes in even greater depth, and his influence can still be felt today.
It's fascinating how he used a form like the dramatic monologue to create this space for psychological exploration.
Yeah.
It's like he's inviting us to become amateur detectives, piecing together the clues to understand these complex and often flawed characters.
And speaking of complex characters and flawed worldviews, we can't leave out Matthew Arnold, another major figure in Victorian poetry.
Okay, tell me about Matthew Arnold. How does his work fit into this landscape of social critique and psychological exploration that we've been talking about?
Well, while Browning delved into those dark corners of the individual psyche, Arnold took a broader look at the anxieties of the Victorian age. He was deeply affected by this loss of faith that was sweeping through intellectual circles at the time,
Right.
sparked by scientific discoveries like Darwin's theory of evolution.
So he was wrestling with that same crisis of faith that we talked about earlier, but maybe from a different angle than Tennyson.
Exactly. While Tennyson seemed to be seeking a way to reconcile faith and science, Arnold was more focused on lamenting the loss of a more certain spiritual age.
Interesting.
He felt that the rise of science and industrialization was eroding traditional values and leaving society adrift in a sea of uncertainty.
That sense of loss of a world where faith felt like a solid ground and now it's kind of crumbling beneath our feet, that's what Arnold captures so powerfully.
You put it perfectly.
He's reflecting those anxieties of his age.
And one of his most famous poems, Dover Beach, embodies this feeling of existential uncertainty.
Okay.
He uses this image of the receding sea of faith to describe the waning of religious belief in Victorian society. It's this powerful metaphor that speaks to the sense of loss and disorientation that many people were experiencing.
Wow, I can already see how this poem kind of speaks to the larger anxieties of the Victorian era.
Yeah.
It's like Arnold is giving voice to this collective unease of a society grappling with profound change and the loss of its traditional moorings.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that Arnold's style is quite different from Tennyson or Browning's.
Oh, okay.
He wasn't as ornate or dramatic. He wrote in this more conversational, restrained style,
Right.
which some might even call melancholic.
So he was tackling these big philosophical questions, but in a quieter, more reflective way.
Precisely.
It's like he's inviting us to contemplate the vastness of the universe and our own small place within it.
And Arnold wasn't just a poet. He was also a prominent literary critic.
Oh, wow.
He believed that literature should grapple with important issues, not just entertain,
Right.
a belief that influenced many writers after him.
So he was shaping the literary conversation of his time, not just contributing to it?
Absolutely.
It's amazing how these Victorian poets, they're all responding to the same cultural shifts, but in such unique and distinctive ways.
Definitely.
We've got Tennyson wrestling with faith and loss, Browning delving into the darker corners of the human psyche, and Arnold lamenting the decline of traditional values.
And we're not even done yet. There's another fascinating poet we need to talk about, Gerard Manley Hopkins.
Ooh, a new name. Tell me about Gerard Manley Hopkins. What made him stand out from the crowd?
Well, Hopkins was a bit of a maverick, even for the Victorian era. He was deeply religious, a Jesuit priest, and his poetry is infused with this intense spiritual awareness. He saw God's presence everywhere, especially in the natural world.
Okay.
And his poems are full of vivid descriptions and celebrations of nature's beauty.
So like the other Victorian poets, he found solace and inspiration in nature,
Yeah.
but maybe with a more explicitly religious slant.
You could say that, but what really sets Hopkins apart is his experimental use of language and rhythm. He developed a unique style called sprung rhythm that broke from traditional poetic conventions.
Sprung rhythm. That sounds interesting. How does it work?
Instead of counting syllables in a line, Hopkins focused on the number of stressed beats.
Okay.
And this gave his poems a very distinctive, almost jarring rhythm that mirrored the natural rhythms of speech.
Interesting.
So it might feel a little jarring at first, but it forces you to pay close attention to each word, each beat. It's like Hopkins is trying to shake us out of complacency, to make us really feel the intensity of his spiritual experience.
It's like he's trying to break free from the constraints of traditional form to create something that feels more raw, more visceral, more connected to the rhythms of life itself.
Exactly. And it's not just the rhythm that's striking. Hopkins' language is also incredibly rich and dense.
Okay.
He uses all sorts of inventive wordplay, alliteration, and internal rhymes to create this almost overwhelming sensory experience for the reader.
Okay, I'm getting the sense that Hopkins was not afraid to break the rules and forge his own path.
Definitely not.
Do you have a favorite poem of his that you could share?
Oh, it's hard to choose just one, but Pied Beauty is a great example of his style. It's a short poem, but it's packed with these vibrant images celebrating the dappled, diverse beauty of God's creation.
Okay.
He talks about skies of couple color and rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim. It's a feast for the senses.
Those are some seriously evocative images. I can see how his religious devotion kind of comes through in his appreciation for the natural world, even in its smallest details.
Absolutely. And another fantastic poem is The Windhover, which describes a falcon in flight with such power and precision. It's a breathtaking example of Hopkins' ability to capture both the physical beauty and the spiritual significance of nature, all while playing with language in these really innovative ways.
So we've met Tennyson, who grappled with faith and loss, Browning, who dove into the psychology of his characters, and Arnold, who lamented the decline of traditional values.
Right.
And now we have Hopkins, who seems to be forging a whole new path with his experimental use of language and rhythm.
Yeah.
It's amazing how diverse these Victorian voices are, even as they're all responding to these same cultural shifts and anxieties.
And that's just a taste of what Victorian poetry has to offer. The next part of our deep dive will take a closer look at how the Victorian era itself, with all its complexities and contradictions, shaped the direction of poetry and how its legacy continues to influence the way we read and write poetry today.
Okay, I'm officially hooked. Stay tuned because we're just getting started with our exploration of Victorian poetry. Welcome back to our deep dive into Victorian poetry.
I'm glad to be back.
Me too.
Yeah.
I've been thinking all week about these poets that we discuss.
Oh, yeah?
Their struggles with faith and doubt, their observations of a rapidly changing world,
Right.
and just how much their work still speaks to us today.
It's pretty amazing.
It's amazing how even across a century, these poems can still feel so alive and relevant.
It is remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what we're going to unpack in this part 2 here.
Okay.
How did Victorian poetry shape the world? It emerged from A&D why should we still care about it now?
Right. It's one thing to acknowledge that they were big names back in the day, right? Tennyson being poet laureate, all of that.
Right.
But it's another thing to understand why their work still matters in the 21st century.
Yeah.
What's the connection between their words and our lives today?
Well, one key reason is that Victorian poetry offers us a language for grappling with universal human experiences.
Okay.
Things like loss, longing, the search for meaning, and the tension between tradition and progress.
Yeah.
Those themes, I mean, they transcend any particular time period.
Right.
They're woven into the fabric of human existence.
That makes sense. I mean, we might not be living through an industrial revolution, but we're certainly surrounded by technological advancements
Oh, yeah.
that are reshaping our world in profound ways.
Definitely.
And just like the Victorians, I think we're struggling to kind of reconcile these changes with our values, our beliefs, and just our sense of who we are.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Think about how the Victorians were wrestling with the implications of Darwin's theory of evolution.
Right.
It challenged their understanding of humanity's place in the universe,
Yeah.
much like advancements in artificial intelligence and genetic engineering are doing for us today.
Totally.
Victorian poetry gives us this framework for exploring those existential questions,
Yeah.
for grappling with the ethical and spiritual implications of scientific progress.
So it's not just that they were dealing with similar issues, it's
Right.
that they were doing so with such depth and insight, you know?
Definitely.
Their poetry provides a language,
Uh-huh.
a vocabulary
Yes.
for articulating these complex feelings and ideas that we might struggle to put into words ourselves.
Exactly. And beyond the thematic connections, there's also the legacy of their artistic innovations.
Yeah, let's get into that.
They were pioneers in terms of form and style,
Right.
experimenting with techniques like the dramatic monologue,
Right.
which Browning used so masterfully, and sprung rhythm,
Yeah.
which gave Hopkins' poetry such a unique energy and cadence.
Those techniques, they really drew me into the poems.
Yeah.
You know, they made me feel the emotions and ideas on this kind of visceral level. It wasn't just reading words on a page.
Right.
It was like experiencing the world through their eyes, you know, feeling the pulse of their thoughts and emotions.
And that's what great poetry does, isn't it? It transcends time and space, connecting us to the minds and hearts of others.
Absolutely.
And those innovations, they didn't end with the Victorian era.
Right.
They rippled outward, influencing later poets like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound,
All right.
who continued to experiment with form and language, building upon the foundations laid by their Victorian predecessors.
So their influence wasn't just limited to their own time.
Right.
It shaped the direction of poetry for generations to come.
Exactly.
Like they planted these seeds
Yeah.
that continued to grow and blossom long after they were gone.
And those seeds are still bearing fruit today.
Yeah.
Contemporary poets continue to draw inspiration from Victorian poetry, whether it's in their exploration of complex themes, their experimentation with form, or their engagement with social issues.
Wow.
The Victorian era might be over, but its poetic spirit lives on in the work of countless writers who are carrying the torch forward.
It's amazing to think about how these writers, you know, separated by time and distance,
Yeah.
are connected through this kind of shared artistic lineage, you know?
Yes.
It speaks to the enduring power of language
Mm-hmm.
to bridge divides and connect us across generations.
Beyond the literary world, Victorian poetry has also left a lasting impact on our culture more broadly. Think about how their works have been adapted into films, plays, operas, and even popular songs.
True.
Their words and images, they've seeped into our collective consciousness,
Yeah.
shaping the way we think about love, loss, faith, doubt, and the human condition.
It's like they've given us this set of lenses through which to view the world,
Right.
a way of framing our experiences and making sense of the complexities of life.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to continue engaging with Victorian poetry, to rediscover its riches
Yeah.
and find new meaning in its words.
Totally.
You know, it's not just a relic of the past.
Right.
It's a living, breathing tradition that continues to speak to us in really powerful ways.
So where do we go from here? What's the takeaway for our listeners who are just beginning to delve into this fascinating world of Victorian poetry?
Well, I'd encourage them to approach these poems with curiosity and an open mind.
Okay.
Don't be afraid to get lost in the language, to let the images and ideas wash over you.
Right.
Victorian poetry can be challenging at times,
Yeah.
but it's also incredibly rewarding.
Totally.
It offers us a glimpse into a rich and complex world,
Yeah.
and it invites us to engage in a conversation that has been ongoing for over a century.
And maybe, just maybe, it'll inspire them to pick up a pen
Yeah.
and add their own voices to this ongoing conversation, to contribute to this ever-evolving tapestry of poetry that connects us across time and space.
Yeah. Beautifully said. Victorian poetry reminds us that language is a powerful tool, capable of shaping our understanding of the world and inspiring us to create beauty even amidst chaos and uncertainty.
Well, I think we've done it. We've journeyed through the landscapes of Victorian poetry, explored its key themes, met its influential figures,
We did it.
and unpacked its enduring legacy. What a rich and rewarding experience it's been.
It has been a pleasure diving deep into these poems with you. I hope our listeners have found this exploration as enlightening and inspiring as I have.
Yes.
Until next time, keep reading, keep exploring, and keep those poetic imaginations alive.
Welcome back to our final exploration of Victorian poetry.
I'm excited for this one.
Yeah, me too. I've been thinking all week about those poets we discussed,
Well,
like,
yeah.
their struggles with faith and doubt, their observations of such a rapidly changing world, and how their work still speaks to us today. It's amazing.
It is remarkable, isn't it? And that's what we're going to unpack in this final part, right?
Yes.
How did Victorian poetry shape the world it emerged from? And why should we still care about it now? What's its lasting legacy?
It's one thing to acknowledge, that they were big names back then, Tennyson being poet laureate,
Right.
but it's another to understand why their work still matters in the 21st century. What's
Yeah.
the connection between their words and our lives today?
Well, one key reason is that Victorian poetry offers us a language for grappling with universal human experiences.
Okay.
Things like loss, longing, the search for meaning, the tension between tradition and progress.
Right.
These themes, they transcend any particular time period. They're woven into the fabric of human existence.
We might not be living through an industrial revolution,
Right.
but we are surrounded by technological advancements
Oh, for sure.
that are reshaping our world in
Okay.
really profound ways.
Definitely.
And just like the Victorians, we're struggling to kind of reconcile those changes with our values, our beliefs, and our sense of who we are.
Precisely. Think about how the Victorians were wrestling with the implications of uh, Darwin's theory of evolution.
Yeah.
It challenged their understanding of humanity's place in the universe, much like, advancements in artificial intelligence and genetic engineering are doing for us today.
Yeah, it's a really interesting parallel.
It is.
Victorian poetry gives us this framework for exploring those existential questions.
Right.
Grappling with the ethical and spiritual implications of scientific progress.
It does.
It's not just that they were dealing with similar issues.
Yeah.
It's that they were doing so with such depth and insight.
Yes.
Their poetry provides a language, a vocabulary for articulating these complex feelings and ideas that we might just struggle to put into words ourselves.
And beyond those thematic connections, there's also the legacy of their artistic innovations.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that.
They were pioneers in terms of form and style,
Yeah.
experimenting with techniques like the dramatic monologue,
Right.
which Browning used so masterfully.
Yep.
Sprung rhythm,
Right.
which gave Hopkins' poetry such a unique energy and cadence.
I was so struck by how those techniques drew me into the poems,
Yeah.
Like they made me feel the emotions and ideas on a visceral level.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't just reading words on a page. It was like experiencing the world through their eyes,
Yeah.
feeling the pulse of their thoughts and emotions.
That's what great poetry does, right?
Yeah.
It transcends time and space, connecting us to the minds and hearts of others.
Totally.
And those innovations didn't end with the Victorian era. They rippled outward, influencing later poets like T.S. Eliot,
Right.
Ezra Pound,
Okay.
who continued to experiment with form and language, building upon the foundations laid by their Victorian predecessors.
So their influence wasn't just limited to their own time.
Right.
It shaped the direction of poetry for generations to come.
For generations.
It's like they planted seeds
Exactly.
that just continued to grow and blossom long after they were gone.
And those seeds are still bearing fruit today.
That's so cool.
Contemporary poets continue to draw inspiration from Victorian poetry, whether it's in their exploration of those complex themes, their experimentation with form, or their engagement with social issues.
Right.
The Victorian era might be over,
Right.
but its poetic spirit lives on in the work of countless writers who are carrying the torch forward.
It's amazing to think about how these writers, separated by time and distance,
Yeah,
are connected through this shared artistic lineage.
really is.
It speaks to the enduring power of language to bridge divides and connect us across generations.
And beyond the literary world, Victorian poetry has also left a lasting impact on our culture, more broadly.
Okay.
I mean, think about how their works have been adapted into films, plays, operas, and even popular songs.
That's true.
Their words and images have seeped into our collective consciousness,
Yeah.
shaping the way we think about love, loss, faith, doubt, the human condition.
It's like that they've given us this set of lenses, through which to view the world, a way of framing our experiences and making sense of the complexities of life.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to continue engaging with Victorian poetry,
Yes.
to rediscover its riches and find new meaning in its words.
Right.
It's not just a relic of the past. It's a living, breathing tradition that continues to speak to us in really powerful ways.
So where do we go from here? What's the takeaway for our listeners who are, maybe just beginning to delve into this fascinating world of Victorian poetry?
Well, I'd encourage them to approach these poems with curiosity and an open mind.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to get lost in the language, to let the images and ideas wash over you. Victorian poetry can be challenging at times,
Yeah.
but it's also incredibly rewarding.
Yeah.
It offers us a glimpse into a rich and complex world, and it invites us to engage in this conversation that's been going on for over a century.
And maybe, just maybe, it'll inspire them to pick up a pen and add their own voices to this ongoing conversation, to contribute to this ever-evolving tapestry of poetry that connects us across time and space.
Beautifully said. Victorian poetry reminds us that language is a powerful tool, capable of shaping our understanding of the world and inspiring us to create beauty even amidst chaos and uncertainty.
Well, I think we did it. We journeyed through the landscapes of Victorian poetry, explored its key themes, met its influential figures,
We did.
unpacked its enduring legacy. What a rich and rewarding experience this has been.
It has been a pleasure diving deep into these poems with you. I hope our listeners found this exploration as enlightening and inspiring as I have.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep reading, keep exploring, and keep those poetic imaginations alive.